Well, folks, we're moving right along here with these episodes that we're doing on our YouTube channel about wild harvest. You've seen Shane Mahoney. He and I have been talking about these things related to wild harvest. We talked about all the health benefits in the last episode. In this episode, we're going to get into the realities of what is required for wild harvest, the landscape issues, the biodiversity issues, the conservation issues, clean air, clean water, productive land, and how we all play a role in that. So I hope that you find this one, number 4, to be relevant to your life, to how you consume wild food, wild harvest. And if you like these, I hope you'll watch them all, and I hope that you'll share them. So here we go, episode number 4. Shane's gonna give us a lot of background about the conservation and other resource issues essential to wild harvest. Well, Shane, here we are doing another part about the Wild Harvest Initiative.
Yes.
That you are the brain trust for and the founder of at Conservation Visions. And you sent me this kind of talking point list that's pretty voluminous.
Yes, I did.
But it's really good stuff. So we're going to get into the next part of it here. And
Good.
This part, if I were to call it something, it's about the requirements of habitat, environment, robust ecosystems, intact systems necessary for wild harvest. And
absolutely.
So we probably take some of that for granted in the US and Canada, even though we have our issues. You know, there's other places in the world where those systems are really, really threatened and pushed to the brink.
Well, if you look at what is taking place globally, you can certainly see that there are differences between different regions of the world in terms of the scale of loss of things. There are many factors that influence that. It's not necessarily about the inherent capacities of peoples or institutions, although that can be part of it. But in many cases, it can be simply a matter of the sheer numbers of people living in a particular region of the world and the demands that very large numbers of densely packed people make on the natural environment. Unfortunately, it is somewhat of a pattern too that in a lot of the places that have very high numbers of people, there often can be issues of wealth distribution and poverty, and an absolute abject need on the part of the people to take as much resource as they can from the natural world, just merely to survive, to feed their children, to maintain their families. So what you really begin to explore when you raise a question like that are issues that extend far beyond what we normally think about when we think about conservation or wild harvesting.
Yeah.
And it enters the domain of the socioeconomic and socio-political and geopolitical structures that are around the world.
Yeah.
You know, every place in the world faces challenges with these things. I mean, but they're matters of scale. Even here in Bozeman, Montana, it's very common to hear people say, well, you know, how many more people are moving into Bozeman and the surrounding area and so on. And then, you know, you drive anywhere outside of Bozeman and, you know, so you see all this land. And I mean, so relative to many other parts of the world, of course, this is a pretty depopulated, you know, part of the planet, or unpopulated part of the planet, maybe both. But the fact that we have strong institutions such as rule of law and governments, that despite the fact there is a certain level of corruption everywhere in the world, in all aspects of life, the scale again of the kind of corruption that takes place in different parts of the world is dramatically different. And in places where corruption runs high, of course, the monies that either are developed internally in a nation or are brought to a nation through aid processes or other international assistance, you know, often get chewed up very substantially before they get turned out into healthcare or education or conservation kind of mechanisms. I think it's certainly true that the United States and Canada, you know, have done very well, you know, by world standards. We're relatively small populations, really, you know, for the land masses we have. You know, we are collectively, some sort of bordered by 3 massive oceans.
Yeah.
We have, in the case of Canada in particular, the northern 1/3 of Canada, the sort of northern temperate and into the subarctic and Arctic systems. There are very, very, very few people who actually live in that massive landscape.
Yeah.
And one of the great changes that's going to take place is potentially in that massive area that has very few people and relatively little infrastructure, and is essentially, big contiguous ecosystems that are still exist in ways they have for very long periods of time. How Canada will decide to appropriately develop, because there is no question there'll be further incursions into that. It's an astounding thing to conceive of the massive scale of that landscape, the northern 1/3 of Canada, and how much land is still available. We've been very fortunate in that not only do we have the rule of law and democracy, and these political considerations may seem a long way from how we conserve species of wildlife in our oceans, rivers, or lands, but in fact they're intimately involved. They're crucial to that. And we have a long history of experimenting with laws and policies and revising those constantly to try to meet new challenges and to do better for the environment and for wildlife over time. It's not so long ago in Canada or the United States that practices in timber harvesting and mining, for example, and energy development, that were commonplace, not terribly long ago,
Right.
would now be considered completely unacceptable by everyone, including the people in the industries themselves.
Yep.
And so we continue to make progress. And once again, if you look at the circumstances in Canada and the United States, we obviously have lots of species that are listed on the endangered species list. That's why we have endangered species legislations in
Right.
both countries. And the reasons for those losses and those imperilments, of course, are things like habitat loss, urban sprawl, industrialization in its various forms. And we are not exempt from those pressures in our 2 countries. But I would say that we have pretty mature systems to try to deal with the issues. But yet you see, even in, let's take a place like a protected area, let's say like Yellowstone. Just look at at what point does there simply become too many people visiting to see the splendors of that natural landscape? So that's a challenge that people who run parks like Kruger in South Africa also face, or people who go to visit the Serengeti. There's also that. I mean, if you could see the interminable list or lineup of Land Rovers and Toyota Land Cruisers about to take tourists into the Serengeti of a particular day, it's like looking at a log jam or a traffic jam in Los Angeles.
Really?
So, even when we are struggling to do the right things, let's say protect very special places and give people access to them because we want people to see them, they remain challenges for people the world over. I'll say also that in terms of this issue of the challenges we face, we bear witness again to the incredible innovative capacity of America. I know I speak about this a lot. I am not an American. A lot of people in Europe think maybe I am an American.
You spend so
much
time here.
But I also speak highly of the country without being, blinded to certain things that all countries have that you might question. But again, if you look at the innovations that have taken place within the conservation space to deal with some of these challenges that are sort of ubiquitous and therefore occur here as well, such as farm bills and the great efforts in conservation easements and so on that have been developed in this country. Now the major debates and efforts being made, even though they're tension-filled, around private lands and private conservation initiatives, et cetera, and the encouragement of those. And when you look at something as phenomenal as Pittman-Robertson funding and Dingell-Johnson funding, and now, most recently, you look at something like the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which will be like a thunderbolt from the sky in terms of what impact. It's going to be a Yucatan event in terms of benefiting state agencies and their capacity, to deliver for a huge diversity of species. So this is something that, conservationists, when looking at the continent overall, need to realize that in the North American space, as we call it, there's Canada, there's the United States, and of course Mexico. Mm-hmm. And all three countries have somewhat different trajectories, obviously, in this regard. Canada and the United States have been very close, have been tied intimately and associated intimately with the North American model. But a lot of the biggest innovations, such as funding mechanisms and such as land conservation strategies and so on, either are unique to the United States of America or often were started in the United States of America and then spread northward like migrating geese and, eventually found their state of play in the Canadian establishment. It's not to say that Canada hasn't developed its own innovations, but I think if you look at it on, in a comparative way, you see much more of this taking place in the United States. And that goes back to the historical, psychological profile of America and the people who came here. There is a drive towards capitalism and a drive towards innovation and a drive towards incentivizing to do good in this country that is very, very highly developed.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful thing actually to see, and it benefits conservation enormously.
Yeah. So when we look at those landscapes from the perspective of a wild harvester, or the ability, as we've spoke previously, to produce wild food, looking at it through the lens of what can this landscape do to produce wild food. An assessment of the U.S. and Canada is, there's always the snapshot of today, but then also the trajectory of going forward of what it looks like. Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic that both, not just our landscapes, but our waters?
Yeah.
Because we always think of conservation as terrestrial when
you live in Newfoundland.
But yeah, and if you're from Newfoundland, you definitely think about the aquatic side of that. I guess the point of that being we've pretty well covered that wild harvesting is completely dependent upon productive landscapes and aquatic systems.
Yes.
And is the snapshot of today to give us optimism or concern, and maybe looking over the horizon in these two countries?
Well, I think there's several things that can be said about this. Number one is no matter how wealthy we are in a conservation sense, to spend that frivolously is a crime against humanity, essentially. Right. We are, in relatively speaking, very strong positions, but we also have some really major weaknesses. One of them you have just touched on, particularly in this country, not as much so in Canada. The United States has tapped into things that, if you look at the history of this country and why it was able to develop as it was, post the extirpation of the peoples who lived here, mm-hmm. accepting that fact and honoring that fact. One of the things that gave great strength to this country from the very beginning were the great rivers it had. Mm-hmm. The Colorado, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and so on. Right. I think very few people recognize how much more difficult it would have been for prosperity to have come to the United States of America without those major thoroughfares that allowed the transportation of goods and services up and down to vast areas. The railways, of course, assisted in this, but I've always thought about the railroads as simply steel rivers. That's mm-hmm. really what they are. Yeah. And they were placed, of course, in cross-purpose, in a sense, to these major rivers that were running to the coast. And but we know that there was massive mistreatment of those great rivers historically. Mm-hmm. It is an important checkpoint to remember that not so terribly long ago, a river caught on fire in the United States.
The Cuyahoga River in Ohio. Yeah.
So, And we also know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that America is running out of water. It is not only to see what's happening in the reservoirs that, have arisen from the damming of some of the great rivers, like Lake Mead, for example. But it's also the fact that we know there's been deep tapping of the aquifers. Right. And we also know that that is a sort of a bit of a terminal list, There's only how many aquifers can you possibly drain. So I think that one of the great, great challenges for the United States in terms of food security overall, including industrial agriculture, the production of fruits and vegetables, but also livestock and so on, is going to be how to provide sufficient water to the landscapes for those purposes. But at the same time, we should not forget that these great wet systems, they feed massive landscapes for wildlife. Yeah. And of course, the interconnectedness of those aquatic systems, from rain and snowfall and snowpack and spring melt and runoff and all those natural phenomena that take place, they feed vast, extensive ranges where a wide diversity of species exists, not just in the river systems themselves, but of course the surrounding landscapes. And so in addition to the increased demand on specific systems, such as the Colorado, for example, the great challenges in the Central Valley of California for water, which, as I've said, already has entailed engineering plans conceived to bring water from the Great Lakes to that site, if you could believe that. Yeah. These all point to what is, in my mind, one of the really precarious aspects for the ecology and economy of the United States of America. If there's one thing we can safely all agree on, is we cannot do without water. Yeah. We
won't get much argument on that point,
no.
I don't think.
And so when you look at the natural systems, therefore, and you think about also things such as a changing climate, which is a much debated topic, but I think probably a lot of people will accept on certain days that, there are strange things happening with our weather systems in places. Yeah. And this is going to affect the provision of water and how the water flows and where the water flows and when the water flows. And on the natural landscapes, of course, you only have to look at around here. Even I, as a visitor to Montana, somewhat infrequently, it's easy to see you've had a wet spring of some sort, right, or you've had a lot of water available, because it is shades of greener than yeah. I remember it at this yeah. time of year. So we see the effect of that, and of course that gets translated. Undoubtedly, the animals will be healthier. There's no question that larger antlers will be thrown this year by antlered ungulates and so on. These are all predictable things. The calves will be bigger, they'll be better fed, they'll grow faster as long as this kind of green is maintained. So I think that the issue of wild food production, as well as the issue of our domestic production, in a sense, these things are all, in one sense, almost, they're not equally vulnerable, but they share a vulnerability over this issue of water. And I think the competitiveness for that is going to increase as we move forward. And I do believe that, as we often think about land, as you point out, and think about the abundance of wild food that's there, the plants, for example, that exist, as well as the fruits and the berries and the birds and mammals and so forth. There is tremendous biomass in our rivers and in our oceans and in our coastal regions and so on. And there is a lot of food there that can be sustainably harvested and maintained. And at the same time, as we've covered in other parts of this session, Randy, provide incentives for people to do the right thing for those particular systems. Yeah. There is no doubt that humanity can do a much better job with all of this than we have done, but there's also no doubt that there are a lot of people and governments over the world trying to do things better. Yeah. Very few people that I've met get up of a day and say, now my mission today is to make the world a worse place.
Let's hope not.
Thankfully. Yeah.
Well, when I look at that in the United States and Canada, I guess I'm kind of an optimist.
Mm-hmm.
But I know over every rise, there are challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And you've mentioned the challenges in the U.S. of water. There's a lot of discussions about just the diversity and the natural diversity of some of our systems. And we see sage grouse struggling across the Intermountain West. And one of the answers has been, well, let's raise them and release them.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's like, hold on, wait a second. This is like saying we're going to convert them to chickens and turkeys, and we're not addressing the real issues. And
that's very true.
We talk about, what role hatcheries are playing for our fish stocks.
Yep.
Again, I get the mitigation. I understand why they're trying to do it. But does that cause us, do these quick solutions or easier solutions deny that there's a far more complex problem? And I think the U.S. and Canada have the ability to take on those problems that are more complex. Mm-hmm. It's just whether or not we will. But for those of us who are wild harvesters, and those who will be, and those beyond them, those are challenges or discussions that we have to have.
Well, these are, we covered some of this as well a little bit in earlier sections where, we talked about the fact that if we really started to look at natural systems, aquatic systems as well as terrestrial systems, fundamentally as food provisioning systems, it would be like, changing the CD in your turntable. All of a sudden you'd go from jazz to rock and roll. You really have to, it really sets in motion a whole different set of chords and riffs and ways of playing and ways of thinking and interpreting and expressing, which would have impact on, obviously, and would rely on changes in government policy and legislation and perspectives. And some of those, I believe, and this is where there's also this connection with the One Health idea, some of those would force us to reevaluate whether some of the things we are doing to support some of the activities that we currently have really make great sense. Mm-hmm. We talked yesterday a little bit, or in an earlier session, about, the perverse subsidies that can be out there in the agricultural fields and in marine fisheries, for example, which most people don't know very much about. Mm-hmm. But those perverse incentives really don't make that much sense, except in the short term. They keep people employed. Of course, that's important. They continue to build economies, but it's all a certain level of fragility and falseness about it. Right. I really believe that if we were to, just take even a section of, say, the United States and Canada, and let's say, well, we're now going to bring all of our policy and scientific and economic and political talent to bear, some kind of think tank operation, and we're going to look at this extensive area. It could be here in Montana and adjacent states. It could be somewhere in northern Canada, and say, let's look at it from this perspective. What kind of changes does that encourage? Indeed, what kind of changes would that necessitate if we were to take that view of landscapes and that view of rivers and coastal zones and so on and so forth? There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we can produce more wild food. That, I think, we know we can burn areas and produce more blueberry plants. Right. I mean, right?
I see it.
We know we can manipulate habitat for, as I said, for species like moose and snowshoe hare, returning, climax stands of black spruce, for example, which is basically a desert for wildlife, and turn that into a mixed softwood, hardwood kind of a system where you have all this lush growth coming up, your young plants initially, your small trees, things that are very accessible to these foragers. And there's no doubt that we can have an absolute explosion of moose and snowshoe hare, because moose can produce twins, they can produce triplets, and I've even seen female moose with 4 calves. Oh. And rabbits, of course, do what rabbits do. We all know about rabbits. So, there's no doubt that we could take experiments like that. One of the suggestions I made a long, long time ago now was when it was before I was chief of research. It was when I was the big game research biologist in Newfoundland. I met with the Minister of Forestry at the time, and that's That's probably 40 years ago, 35 years ago, and I said, his name was Byrne, Ed Byrne. I said, Mr. Byrne, why don't we think about, with some of these relatively isolated communities on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, why don't we consider giving them a significant portion of Crown land, as we call it,
Right.
Public land,
Right.
essentially, and then allow the forest industry, which knows how to manipulate the landscapes, they've got great training in this,
Yeah.
and some biologists to actually create wildlife Edens, primarily for harvest. So this idea has been incubating with me for a long time, Randy, and that never happened. But my point is that we could, at different scales, experiment with this. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and upend everything that we have. But I really believe wild harvesting is already fundamental to billions of people on this planet. First thing we have to do is safeguard all of that, every aspect of it, whether it's people commercially fishing or whether it's hunters taking animals off the land personally or people berry picking. These ought to be kind of sacred spaces,
Yeah.
We will protect that. But I also believe that we're able to expand beyond that and increase these harvests and increase the opportunities for people to share in all of that. And I also fundamentally believe that placing wild food at the center of an effort to build communities and to build integration, and therefore ultimately to build a sense of rapport between people of different cultures, can, and I mean this, effectively assist in nation building.
Mm-hmm.
I really believe that is true. So I think that Canada and the United States have demonstrated tremendous innovation over the years. The North American model is an example. And I think we'll continue to do that. But we are talking here at some level. Simply maintaining our hunting culture, that's not a major innovation. That's something people kind of accept. Looking at landscapes primarily as food provisioning systems, that's a bit of a revolution.
Yeah, and you are planting that seed, Shane, whether you realize it or not. Because yesterday when you mentioned to me about some of our forests are considering X tonnage of berries
Yes.
need to be sustainably harvested through the management of this forest.
Yep.
My mind starts wandering, and I'm thinking about the salmon stocks that used to be from the Sacramento River, the Columbia Basin, the Fraser River that you guys have in Canada, however far up you want to go. What if we looked at river systems such as those and said, for whatever activity happens here, it has to produce this amount of wild tonnage of fish?
Why not?
And yes, we can have maybe some, right now, the measurement is how low can we keep the cost of hydroelectricity?
Yeah.
Or how cheap can we keep water for irrigation of crops?
Yes.
Or how low can we keep the cost of barging and transporting?
Yep.
Never in that equation does it say, well, within this, we have to still maintain X number of tons of wild fish.
No.
For harvest,
And
for wild harvest.
Yeah. And that's a mistake.
If you think about how revolutionary it would be to look at it that direction, and what the subsequent changes in policy that would have to be required, the reprioritization of what we value, what gets subsidized, or has to now pay its full share.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Those are mindsets that I'm embarrassed to say that at my age I'd never looked at it that way.
I don't think anyone ever has. I mean, this is a breakthrough idea, Randy. I mean, I'm not saying it because I came up with it, but I know enough about the history of conservation globally and in Canada and the United States to know that this is a breakthrough idea. Mm-hmm. And many people, when they meet it first, think at it at one level. Well, that'll be great if we can maintain, let's say, hunting and angling or things like this. And of course, that's one of the purposes. But ultimately, it's to show that the kinds of benefits that come from those communities who catch their own fish or who harvest their own berries or who harvest their own meat, that those kind of benefits can be extended to a much greater group of people in our societies. And we also, are entering a phase where the international focus on conservation is realizing more and more that the top-down decision-making by federal agencies, for example, or by national agencies, even within their own country, that top-down kind of an approach does not necessarily always work the best for everything, right? They're a bit of an understatement, I know,
Right.
talking in one of the state like Montana, but my point is some national regulation is clearly required on some things. We all accept that. But there's a much, much stronger emphasis today on trying to think about both indigenous peoples, but also local peoples. And I think this, too, is an enormous opportunity for this kind of thinking, because it is not simply, an idea that has to push the entire world and the entire intellectualism around conservation. This is an idea that already has all kinds of potential satellite partner ideas that are out there that can help build this kind of realization, and in some ways encourage us to recognize the basic biology and ecology of humanity. Just as these big river systems in, say, the Pacific Northwest or in Alaska, for example, that feed the bears as well as the salmon, and then the nutrients of the dying salmon feed the vegetation and feed the trees and feed the production of all kinds of other foods that human beings and wildlife itself is able to take advantage of and rely on. That kind of integrated beauty, that systemic kind of flow into and out of something that ultimately creates this kind of productivity that all of us, the bear, the salmon fisherman, the eagle, we can all take part in this. And so I do think it's potentially revolutionary, but I also think there are probably little examples of this happening, Randy, that we need to gather up, like gathering pearls, and putting them on a thread, till eventually you see exactly what we have. And I don't think it's beyond our capacity. I think that we have great opportunities to work with private landowners with respect to that, because, of course, many of them are involved with growing things on that land. Yeah. So I think I think its time has come, and then because of the great pressures to do better things for biodiversity, if we can demonstrate that the well-fed human, fed by wild foods as much as is reasonable, becomes a champion at some level of advocacy for the maintenance of these natural systems, then I think we've sort of come full circle, and I think we have a chance to do even better things for the environment than we have done in the past, and even better things for people than we have done in the past.
Yeah. The opportunity is there. It's whether or not the power, the will be there.
Well, the will comes from the people, Randy.
That's true. That is absolutely
despite all the
true.
imperfections in our democratic systems, let me tell you, ultimately every politician knows, whether it's the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Canada or a governor of any state or whatever, ultimately they know that even if they're riding the highest crest of power, that they can be elevated right down to the lower than a snake's belly in a rut by public opinion.
Yeah.
And so
that
power still resides.
I guess that is a reminder to us that it's really within us of what we're going to demand.
If we want this wild harvest kind of concept for the world, we need to stand up and fight for it. Now that also means that arguments, advocacy by hunters, by anglers, by other foragers needs to be intensified, but the commentary also needs to be expanded and much more inclusive. We can't just be concerned about whether I'm going to get that tag for that deer this year in that particular location. I understand why that matters, but it will call upon our user groups, those who are members of the hunter and foraging community, to actually take bigger views, more expansive views of all of this kind of thing, and I believe we're fully capable of doing that.
Well, I'm in.
Good.
Well, Shane, as the person leading the Idea of the Wild Harvest Initiative, how do you get people to wrap their mind around this real quickly, how important lands and waters are, the conservation of those, to this wild harvest?
Well, I think it's fairly simple. I mean, ask people to go out and stand in the middle of a parking lot in a big grocery store or some kind of other industrial complex and ask yourself, how much wildlife do you see? So, that's probably the best way to get the counter-example, the counter-reality. Yes, ultimately, healthy wildlife, healthy fish depend on healthy landscapes and healthy rivers, and human beings depend on exactly the same things. You can have relatively healthy systems where you have very few fish and wildlife because you do something crazy. You overharvest, you deplete them for one reason or another. But the opposite is not true. You cannot have abundant wildlife and fish if you do not have the natural environments in the right condition for them to survive. Remember, they don't go to grocery stores.
Right.
They don't go to hostels or hotels in the evening time. Wild things live wild 24 hours a day, and they have to have what they require to live. It's a very simple concept, and I think most little humans from 3 or 4 years of age up will get that very easily. Yeah. They'll be able to understand it very well, even if some of our elected officials sometimes seem like they don't.
So you're saying that is policy and the will of the people?
Policy and the will of the people, and I also say sometimes that we ought to listen to children a hell of a lot more. I mean that too. After all, they're still living like little animals. It takes us about 5 or 6 years to turn those little animals into little humans. You have to remember. Mm-hmm. They operate like little animals for a long period of time if you watch children closely. And then eventually we get them, more and more like ourselves, but it takes a hell of a lot of work. I mean, it drives parents nuts because they got to try to do this kind of stuff. But I mean, So I like to listen to little children. I like to watch them, and I like to see what they do when you just, let them be outside the sort of reach or the arm reach of their parents, and just see how they look at things in the natural world. They grab stinger nettles and sting their hands. As I said, they put worms in their mouths and eat them. They pick up insects. They put dirt in their mouths and chew it and happily swallow it, and so on and so forth. I mean, they're demonstrating the perfect inherent willingness to taste literally the natural environment in which they live, and to touch it and experience it. We have billions of people in the world today who, as mature adults, would be terrified to have those experiences. Yeah. Because all that little animalness was taken away from them, taken out of them. Yeah. I think that's insanity. Well, anyway, that's how I feel.
I'm with you. I like that part. I think we manufacture our own problems through the way that we as we grow and as we have expectations and demands, and how we prioritize, and we lose some of that touch to that what is natural.
I mean, all animals have cultures, right? This is something also that a lot of biologists don't accept or think about, and a lot of people in the public. All animals have cultures, and in a sense, all animals have schools. They're constantly teaching, younger people in society how to live. The only thing is, or younger animals in society how to live. The only thing is about other species, I mean, they teach their young to live in the same world as their parents, and the same world as their grandparents and their great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. We have invented a new way of living that's called modernity. And we don't teach our children, by and large, there's some exceptions, but generally we do not teach our children to learn and understand human biology. Mm-hmm. We teach our children, we want them to learn how to live in this manufactured existence that we have created. And we're the only species that does that. Yeah. The bear never tries to teach its cub how to live as a bobcat, or how to live as a as a squirrel, they have their lifestyles. And of course, indigenous peoples, the world over, did what the animals did. That's another big topic. So
yeah, I was going to say, we might need chapter 6 or 7 to explore that one, Shane. The human behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We all went to the wrong school, right? Most of us.
So Shane, a lot of people may disagree with this, but wild harvest can be one of the conservation mechanisms that we use for this sustainable process of wild harvest.
Yes.
And, I mean,
there's
many examples that show that here, and in your work with the IUCN and others, you see it.
We do, and of course we've had, as you say, we've had our own clarion example of how this can actually be effective. Essentially, you want to develop systems like in the Greek mythologies of the snake that eats its own tail. It's a constant kind of circle that sustains itself. And let's face it, we know that for people who are living very close to nature, let's take some indigenous peoples perhaps living in parts of Africa or in Amazonia, whatever. I mean, they don't have to be taught about the realities of how to acquire animal life and other medicinal plants and other kinds of ways of living. And they naturally, of course, are incentivized about this landscape. This is their home. Mm-hmm. This is like your home. Of course they want to preserve it. Of course they want to keep it. And of course they want it to work. They don't want it to be polluted. They don't want it to be disfigured. They don't want it to be, they don't want it to lose its aesthetics. They don't want it to, they want it to be healthy and natural. But for people, which means most of the people on the planet today, there has been some level of distance brought into the history of their families and nations to the point where they are not living, obviously, those lifestyles anymore. Yeah. We have to develop intellectual approaches to that to explain to people like that, why it is so important to conserve nature and so on. But we see clearly examples, even in non-indigenous societies, where people have been brought to understand that if they are benefiting from the natural world in some way, it could be that their business relies on it. It could be that their food supply relies on it. It could be that for reasons of faith or mythology or cultural identity, they simply have to have access to certain resources. These people will, as I said, develop an attitude of protection, of wanting to keep things. That extends even to the people outside of those natural systems, as I said, because we have developed, by we, non-indigenous people, we have also developed attachments to the natural world that are old but have been modified through time. Yeah. And so take the hunting community or the angling community or the recreating community in the wild. I mean, all of those communities want to see those landscapes and those wildlife there for a purpose. Mm-hmm. So it's not accidental that so many hunting organizations have arisen over time that fight to conserve wildlife. Right. They're incentivized to do it. They love to hunt and they love to eat the animals that they hunt, and they're smart enough to know that it doesn't happen by accident. Yeah. I mean, this is the extraordinary thing about some of the dimensions of thinking around conservation today, which seems to imply that if you just, kind of pull man out of the system, as though that were possible, that if you pull man out of the system, things can just roll along. Right now on this planet, 8 billion naked apes are collectively responsible for the future of all wildlife. It is in all of creation's time, there has never been a circumstance where this has been true before. But it is now true. The fate of every single wildlife species ultimately depends on the decisions we make, the decisions we fail to make, or the decisions we refuse to make. And it is true of the great whales. It is true of the migrating flocks of shorebirds. It is true of the octopi that scuttle around in their rock and coral caves. It's true of the bison. It is true of the polar bear and the grizzly. It is true of all life forms. So that means, abjectly, just that statement, that their future relies entirely on us. If we are not incentivized to act on their behalf, then of course we will not make the right decisions. We will defer decisions.
Right.
We will fail to take decisions. And the end result will be we'll lose all the pollinators on our planet.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Right. Good luck.
Right now you're importing into this country, I think it's 100 million bees a year, into the United States of America. Every year. That's what you have to import to make sure that your fruits and vegetables are actually pollinated.
Yeah.
But let's say we scale that up, and that's like all over the world. No one has any bees or wasps or butterflies or things of this nature. No, we have to find incentive for people to do the right thing. And we have so many examples of where people, when incentivized, because they are drawing benefits from nature, and they can be diverse kinds of benefits, as I said, so many examples of proving when that happens that conservation really works. The North American model itself is a classic example of incentivized conservation. Mm-hmm. The people who cared because they received some benefits from nature, and that included hunters, but of course there were other constituencies that were involved. But let's talk about hunters, because it's such an abject thing. They go out, they take animals, they harvest them, they bring them back, they consume them. We took wildlife. Most American citizens today, just like most Canadian citizens today, have not the slightest clue, not the slightest fragment of awareness of how close we came 120 years ago or so to losing not just species like the passenger pigeon and nearly losing the bison, of course, but also losing the Carolina parakeet and the Labrador duck and the Eskimo curlew, and on we could go. Right. But how close we came to losing the species that we now consider so common, the wild turkey and the whitetail and the mule deer and the elk and the black bear and the Canada goose and the wood duck and the pronghorn and so on. Beavers were essentially extinct, extirpated. Think about this. Extirpated east of the Rocky Mountains. Yeah. How was it even possible for us to take every one of those plump rodents out of all of their haunts to the point where we basically extirpated them across that massive think of the size of that land, Randy, and what it took, what kind of effort it took to do that. Yeah. These were the realities that we had. And now we can look at, not all species, of course, because we had problems like with DDT, with our raptorial birds and so on, but you look at those species that people wanted most to have, the species that provided them with food, provided them with opportunity to hunt, which was something that people enjoy at many different levels. And we sit today with massive numbers of these species. Yeah. And in most cases, growing numbers of these species or oscillating at very, very high levels of these species. Even take something like bears. Black bears. These are big boys when they grow up, and
they're not that well behaved sometimes.
No, exactly. They're not good, wedding guests. They can destroy a lot of things, and periodically they will run down and deliberately kill and eat human beings. Mm-hmm. But for all of they're wonderful animals. But for all of their negatives and positives combined, we have 1 million of them. Yeah. And it's a funny thing, it's a little small side, but about this black bear business. If you think about black bear, grizzly, and the water bear, the white bear, the polar bear, we have such different attitudes towards the three of them, don't we, really? Mm-hmm. Like the black bear, first of all, there's a lot of hunting of black bear in a lot of different places, and it's generally accepted.
Right. Great food
source. We don't have, we have some pushback on that, but not quite as much as, say, when we talk about grizzly.
Right.
But the black bear is the one who is most endeared to people. You know, people love you. So you have all these images of people having black bears sitting on their verandas, you know, the people are feeding them nuts and feeding them apples. I'm not recommending that, but I mean, we do see these images all the time.
Right.
And there is something endearing or endeared in the minds of humans about our black bears, and yet we tolerate a lot of hunting.
Mm-hmm.
With the grizzly, the great bear, you know, he's kind of a different cat. You know, he's basically a barren ground, open land performer in the main. And he really only developed one reproductive strategy in terms of his cubs, her cubs, obviously. And that was to defend with aggression.
Mm-hmm.
The black bear had the option of sending those babies up that tree. And so there's a classic difference of aggression, obviously, between the great bear and between the black bear. And the grizzly can be, you know, a bit hard around some other things, like he can prevent people from going to places because he lives there.
Yeah.
He can wreak a bit of havoc with sheep sometimes and with cattle and various other things like that. And he's just a badass bear.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, with him, there's a huge controversy about whether he should be hunted at all. Now, some cases because numbers are low, but even where numbers in some cases are high, like in British Columbia, for example,
Right.
you know, there's this strange feeling about it. And these kinds of attitudes, I guess, to step away from this aside for the moment, I worked on black bears for many, many years, so I've got a lot of personal experiences with them. These attitudes towards individual species can also influence our harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, some people, for example, don't like to eat bear meat because it's a bear.
Right. Oh,
Right?
You hear it all the time.
Yeah.
It's,
So it's not quite sure how we got off on that, but anyway.
no, we're talking about just how the human perception of certain species determines how we use
and whether
wild
we are
harvest.
incentivized to do it, you know.
And,
I mean,
and are we going to conserve for those?
Yeah.
And especially those that we do harvest and that we do eat.
and the big next leap for all of that, Randy, is to get people to be incentivized for systems.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not that easy to get, you know, to have it's hard to imagine, you know, an NGO dedicated to the increase and advancement and management of mosquitoes, right? It's not something that's going to happen. But, you know, when you think about the number of mosquitoes consumed by bats, for example, and by songbirds, by fish, and so on, it's an enormous biomass that's flowing through that system. So I think we really do need to bring people to a level where they're thinking about systems a lot more. And I would really appeal to the hunting community watching this to start retraining their minds and hopes and visions. Some already have this, of course, but we can go a lot further in our community of developing a systems-based approach. And that carries with it a lot of things about harvesting and our opportunities to harvest, maintaining the wildlife that we wish to harvest, but it also forces us to think a lot more about really complicated and sometimes conflicted spaces, like the role of predators in our natural systems and so forth.
Now, as you talk about that, I think about my involvement in grizzly bears right here in our backyard. You know, we are on the edge of the Yellowstone ecosystem, which has the most southernmost population of those great bears, grizzly bears, that are at this point doing remarkably well. But a lot of the argument about whether they should be federally protected or management turned over to the state is all about whether or not we're going to hunt them. And in my mind, it's this, I want to jump up and down and celebrate that we now have maybe upwards of 1,000 grizzly bears
Incredible.
in this area with some of the highest tourism involvement, some of the highest demands on landscapes, some of the most rapid development of the Intermountain West. But yet we want to fight and argue over if we should hunt them or not hunt them.
Yeah, maybe 4 of them or something.
Yeah. And it takes us away from the bigger picture of, in spite of all of its imperfections of the greater Yellowstone region, I think there's a lot to be learned that a region with that much human activity can accommodate this rather cantankerous, incorrigible fella who requires a lot of space.
Yes, I think it's one of the greatest recent achievements in our conservation efforts. If we can bring back the big bear, the great bear, if we can bring him back, and he'll trundle along as he rolls his shoulders, you know, he'll trundle along and bring us a few problems. There's no question about that. But it is an extraordinary thing to think that the landscape that was devoid of them, and one time their distribution, as you know, was incredibly
way
wide.
out into the plains.
They were even in Labrador. So you're looking all the way from the top northeast portion of the continent all the way down to, you know, California,
Mexico.
New Mexico, and Mexico itself.
Yeah.
It's, I think it's, I agree with you, Randy. I think it's one of the signal achievements of our wildlife conservation efforts.
Yeah.
And I do believe that if we can learn, and I think we are learning. I mean, after all, there is controversy, and there is debate, and there is tension, and there are lawsuits and all of that kind of thing.
Yep.
But they are there, aren't they?
They are. I
You
see
know, they
that.
are there. You know, I went to look at them about 2 years ago. I was here, and there were 5 of them on this one. In one vista, I could see these 5 great bears. One was a sow with a couple of cubs. There was one very large boar, and there was 2 other animals there. And you know, it was just astounding to think that you were actually looking at 5 grizzly bears.
Yeah.
And I was talking with the local people there, and they had, you know, they had various views on them. They weren't all negative. Some were a little bit negative. Some were incredibly positive, and some were very proud to be able to, you know, tell you, oh yes, Shane, if you come up, you'll see them. Like, and I almost thought, well, that's not going to happen, but we went there and we did see them. And
and we do that within an area that has, you know, 300,000-400,000 people living there.
So all incentives.
And millions of visitors.
Yes. So all incentives don't have to be for food, of course.
Right.
There can be incentives just for the aesthetic as well.
And
But beauty is also a harvest.
a harvest, yeah. You've made that very clear. And when we talk about systems, I think there are certain things we can look to say, that shows there's still some resiliency in that system. As much pressure as we've put on it,
Absolutely.
the systems are astounding. They are beyond what our capacities are in some instances.
Well, the oceans are a classic case of that, aren't they?
Yeah. So Shane, as someone who participates in this, I'm going to argue all day long about the ecological and environmental benefits of wild harvest.
Sure.
Am I out in the weeds? Am I looking through a lens that is biased, or are there truly those benefits, and the land set aside for that, and the places it happens?
Well, you know, I'd like to partition the question just a little bit.
Sure.
So the answer is yes, Randy. You are out on the weeds, but not about this particular point. No, I mean, I think that we understand almost intuitively that if we spend time in nature, we derive benefits, and the evidence is so clear about the value and health and naturalness of wild food. In other words, that our bodies are adapted to accept those foods and make maximum use of those foods, etc. That I think it goes without saying that there are incredible positive implications for human beings and for diets and for food security as far as we can make that available. There can be, I don't think, any challenge to that. The larger benefits, of course, that derive from it is that, you know, as we've talked about considerably on this effort, is that there are these larger benefits to the environment, and that we incentivize people, of course, who want to look after that. Again, it comes back to this idea of the holistic relationship between human beings, wildlife, and the landscapes. And, you know, even if we didn't take a single thing off the land, if we didn't harvest a single berry, a single mushroom, a single elk, a single rainbow, whatever, we'd still have an inherent aesthetic sense of what the land ought to look like. Yeah. And if we keep it in that kind of frame, then of course we will have lands that will give us the magic of wildlife.
Yeah.
Forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can just think about growing up downstream from a paper mill on the Canadian-American border. So we'll use you and I as those places. The Rainy River divides Minnesota and Ontario.
Yep.
And there were signs posted along the river, do not eat these fish.
Mm-hmm.
But the demand for fish to eat was significant.
Mm-hmm.
And between a whole lot of other competing factors in the 70s, people wanted that changed.
Mm-hmm.
And now the Rainy River, as it flows into Lake of the Woods,
Mm-hmm.
is a remarkable fishery.
And it's clean.
And it's clean.
Yeah.
And back to some of your points about the will of the people and their desire to have landscapes that are producing wild harvest.
Yes.
Can result in change.
Absolutely. It can. And
For me, that's-
the benefits flow everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? They flow everywhere. They flow to nature, they flow to ourselves. And there's something beautiful about being able to restore systems that have been degraded. There's a major global push to do this now on a very, very large scale. In the Convention on Biodiversity that we will sign in December in Montreal, hopefully, this round of it, there is a major emphasis on the idea of restoration of landscapes and ecosystems.
Yeah.
And if the world gets serious about this, we could see that happen on a massive scale globally. And your example of the Rainy River, hopefully can be magnified around the world thousands of times.
Yeah.
And people can fish then once again in the Thames,
Yeah.
in London. It would be extraordinary, wouldn't it?
It would be,
Yeah.
when you think about that.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is just letting people, or giving them planting the seeds that allow their minds to go to those possibilities.
Absolutely.
And we're sitting here not far from what could have been, and sometimes it's the thing that never was that we take for granted, where we were going to dam the Yellowstone River just south of Livingston, and it would have been dewatered by the time I got to Billings for energy production. And you think about, take a 100-mile stretch of one of our most valuable river resources that flows into the Missouri to the Mississippi. But the people stood up and said, no, we don't want that. We value what this river is in its natural state and all that it provides, and the lifestyles and the communities and the cultures. And
how long ago was that?
That was 1978.
Yeah.
So
if that had been 1928, it might have happened.
It would have happened. Surely would have.
Yeah.
And so now, in spite of the people at the time being thought of as some crazy lunatics, now they're viewed as visionaries.
Of course they were. They were visionaries.
They were.
Yeah.
They saw the value of an intact system and what it could do for all things, including the wild harvest.
Yep. Absolutely.
Well, Shane, I'm sitting here as an accountant, so I'm kind of a numbers guy. I'm a little bit of a, you can say that, but where are the numbers that support what you're telling me? And you as a scientist, I know numbers are important to the entire body of science and the idea of science. There's this Texas study that I've read in some of the documents that you've shared with me. Just looking at that seems to be such a, like headlights flashing. Look, this is really happening.
It is, and we, like so many things about the Wild Harvest Initiative, it's all new, so it's incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
You cannot forecast what you're going to get. It's kind of like being dropped out of an aircraft in a strange piece of land that you can't identify. You don't know what country you're even in, but you know you're going to fish a river, and you really have no idea when that first tug comes on that line, what you're actually going to land.
Yeah.
And it's very similar with the efforts we're making here, and it's part of what makes doing this work so enjoyable and so exciting. So we started out with this first, sharing survey, where we, go to partner states and we arrange with them to send questionnaires to their successful hunters and ask them a whole series of questions about what they do with their wild foods that they harvest and so on. And we're interested in, how much of their food they share, what percentage of all of the hunters that are successful do in fact share food. And we're interested in the distribution of this food, because I very much want to discover, you know, the transportation corridor of this wild meat, right? The sociological channels by which it gets disseminated. Because they're going to be very important for understanding societal values around these kinds of issues. Who gets the meat, and you know, how are they connected with the primary source, which is the hunter? And so we found that, you know, in excess of 97% of the hunters in that state actually shared, you know, some of their meat.
97%.
Actually shared some of their meat. And what that says is that, you know, almost every hunter in that state, in one way or another, and to someone or another, they actually shared the meat that they harvested themselves. Now, some of those harvest, of course, was with people that were in their own homes, and some of that were with people who were not in their own homes. So we had, in total, the hunters in Texas were sharing the food they harvested with about 5.8 million people other than themselves. And about 2.1 million of those people were actually outside of the hunter's household.
Wow.
And it's very important. A lot of people might say, well, what's the significance of somebody, you know, sharing the food inside their household? Well, this is very much a part of the process of cultural inheritance and cultural transition. Not every child will necessarily want to grow up to be a hunter, but the fact that every child is eating or consuming or being exposed to the possibility, the chance to consume wild meat is a very significant thing. The proportion of people who reside outside of the household obviously includes some extended family, an uncle, an aunt, or whatever, but it also includes colleagues and friends at work who may or may not ever have hunted themselves. But again, you see this kind of reach that results from this inherent desire. It's almost a you know, something that can't be avoided in the individual. This desire to share these wild products with people. And so in the very first survey that we did, and we've done them in quite a number of other states now, and we're looking to get the data to do comparative things with it, you know, we suddenly realized that the footprint of this, the footprint of hunting in a sense, but the footprint of the meat itself extends far beyond the hunter and the hunter's husband or wife and the hunter's children and so on. And I think that's a very significant thing for us to ponder, because I believe the more people who encounter wild meat will find a wild meat that they really like, if not almost all of them. And I think they will then begin to recognize that wildlife does not only have an aesthetic purpose, but it does have very much a food-related purpose. And then they may better understand the individuals, the men and women who harvest these animals for that particular purpose. You know, that they're not harvesting it and saying they're eating the meat, and actually it's terrible and no one really eats it. You know, they bury it in a hole in the ground in the center of their house. They actually discover that this is delicious and it's good for them. And so we hope these surveys are really going to change a lot of people's minds about all of this. And then imagine if we put our minds to it and we really wanted to encourage even wider distribution of that meat in some way. Then we could reach more people and more people and more people. And I believe the more people that we touch nature with, the more people we're going to find that have a love for nature, a feeling for nature, and that will be translated into trying to do something for her. And every step an individual makes in doing something for nature, as I've said over and over again, they do it for humanity. There's not a lot of things that you can say you can do at a small scale that can have that kind of a global impact. But something for nature does inherently have that.
Well, these bits and pieces of data and surveys and stuff that are coming from what you're doing at the Wild Harvest really are helpful of taking this body of work you're doing and getting people to just say, wow, 97.7% share.
Yes.
That touches 5.8 million people, 2 point whatever million of them would not have reason to be exposed to
They would
wild
never.
harvest.
Yes, certainly there's a percentage of that. That's true. And you know, there's a lot of change in workplaces today, and of course, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, a lot of these meals outside the family household, one of the categories that was clear was people bringing a meal to their business and,
Right.
and sharing a chili or a spaghetti or something like
Mm-hmm.
a stew, something like that, you know, with their coworkers. And many of those coworkers maybe never have hunted in their lives, but all of a sudden they have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
And it's very, very seldom, in my experience, that people who have tasted wild meat say, no, I really don't like that. Some
Yeah.
do, and for certain meats, like seal meat, what we eat,
Yeah.
not everybody likes seal meat. But in general, the ungulates in particular, which are the animals we've hunted for a very long period of time,
Mm-hmm.
generally people, you know, with elk and moose and deer and so on, there's a general acceptance that is tasty, good food, and we know it's good for you. So it's a very important aspect of the study to know where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
The truck, we call it, the truck of the meat. Where that ends up is an incredibly important part of all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's studies out there about how, well, this is where we're sitting here with Yellowstone Park, the biomass of what are the grasses, forbs, and other
Yeah.
growth in Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah.
The elk migrate there, the bison
Yeah.
are there, the mule deer are there, but they don't stay there.
No.
They leave, they
Yeah.
come out. And
Yeah.
that biomass gets transported through the elk
Yeah.
to here we are north of Yellowstone, where a lot of us will take an elk
Of
and
course.
put it in our freezer.
Yeah.
And you think about the remarkable way that system transfers energy.
Well,
It's
there's no question. I mean, early man, in our early stages of our existence, of course, we understood those things profoundly. They weren't. I mean, some of the modern science that we have would have surprised, you know, the peoples living in Europe 30,000 years ago and the people living in North America 30,000 years ago. Some of it, a lot of it wouldn't have surprised them at all.
yeah,
The idea of migrate, you know, how animals migrated and where they migrated through and when you would pick them up and where you would find them and where their calving ranges were and where they went to lamb and all these kinds of things. I mean, all of that was kind of like, you know, living 101, right? You know, we spent an enormous amount of time putting radio collars and flying around and satellites tracking them and all that kind of stuff. But none of that would have been of any great surprise to the early residents of this continent. But there would have been some things that they might have, that might have been, you know, a bit surprising. But certainly their understanding of how the natural environment could change the quality of the animal, and knowing at what time the animal was best to eat and when it was best to be killed, all of those kinds of things, we now know, if we examine that they were taking animals that were providing very specific kinds of nutritional advantages at that time.
Yeah.
Even, for example, the traditions of harvesting the fetuses from pregnant females. And, you know, in a number of Inuit cultures, you know, that was considered a delicacy, of course.
wow.
And it was also very easy for some of the elderly people to actually eat because it was very tender, you know, it was very soft meat and could be eaten. And that allowed them, of course, to gain access to an incredibly healthy form of food because obviously that little animal was being fed inside its mother with everything that it needed, and it was still in a major growth phase, and you know it had not been in the outside environment to pick up parasites or any of these kinds of things. So there were all kinds of peculiar ways in which insightful ways in which they understood how to harvest wildlife and how to consume it. And they also understood what not to do. I mean, when the first British explorers, mostly British explorers, you know, went into the Canadian Arctic, you know, the famous kind of Franklin expeditions and so on, went up there. I mean, they'd shoot these, you know, shoot these polar bears, for example. They see these massive livers, you know, that look so absolutely fantastic, but, you know, you can easily develop hypervitaminosis by consuming these delicious looking
Really?
livers. And of course, the Inuit would tell them, "Oh no, you can't eat that much of that. This is how it had to be partitioned out." So they had learned through thousands of years these amazing things about food, and that is why I lament so much that that all of that knowledge, not all of the knowledge, there's still some of it, but obviously we must all admit that a very great percentage of that knowledge has been lost, and we are not likely to recover it now because of the time periods that have passed. But that makes the knowledge that the Indigenous peoples still have, quite precious to us, and we need to make much more use of it than we do.
Let's see. White-tailed deer harvest is almost 1 billion meals.
Yes.
In the U.S. and Canada. Wow. Okay.
I mean, you look at the statistics that you can see associated with some of the basic information that we're coming back with, and you see even something like wild turkey, which is it's not a huge animal,
right?
But when you look at the harvest across Canada and the United States, you're looking at about 22 million meals that are being provided at about a 6-ounce serving. So you think about this, and you start thinking about 22 million meals in that particular case. You look at something with white-tailed deer, and of course you have almost 1 billion.
1 billion
Almost,
with a B.
Yeah,
meals.
Well, you have 890 million or something.
But 6 ounce.
6 ounces of serving of
high quality.
Yeah. So you start adding that up, and you have to remember we're doing this for every single species that is harvested in every single jurisdiction in Canada and the United States. So you begin to realize what you're going to end up with here in terms of the total number of meals that we have then priced, because we have gone through the various ratings to say, well, if you didn't have that, and we assume that you're a meat eater, and therefore you're going to acquire beef or pork or turkey at the grocery store, you're going to pay on average, let's pick a number, $5 per pound or something of this nature. But when you're talking about billions and billions of pounds, now you start to think about the food economy aspects of not having that, that natural food. Now you pay something for that natural food. Let's be transparent and intellectually honest. There's investments of money and time, to acquire that wild food. But again, when you go to the grocery store and you buy a piece of meat, you are certainly helping certain parts of the economy, because the people who raise meat and who butcher meat and who package meat and transport meat and so on, that they are being supported in that way. But what you are not doing is you are not, investing directly back in the natural world and those natural food production systems. But when you take that elk, or you take that turkey, or you take that whitetail, you certainly do give something back to that natural world, which helps sustain this kind of a process in a continuous way. I mean, 145 million meals, even for an animal that's not killed in huge numbers, but is a big animal, elk, that's about the number of meals that are being generated by elk.
145 million meals. Almost 1 billion with whitetail. So you add the two together and you're over 1 billion meals between elk and whitetails.
Yeah.
That's, if you are
now think of waterfowl. Just imagine when you put waterfowl in there, the number of waterfowl that we actually harvest.
Upland birds, rabbits.
They're relatively small at 2.5 pounds per, kind of eviscerated carcass. But nevertheless, you are looking at, this is the point. No one is saying in the Wild Harvest Initiative that we are harvesting at current rates, for example, of wild meat that in any way can completely supplant or replace, and it's not the attempt.
Right.
But the attempt is to show that if the scale here, like we have recreational harvest in Canada and the United States that are providing on average about 1 billion meals, 1.5 billion meals annually.
At 6 ounces of
meat.
Amazing, high quality, the type of meat everyone looks for,
exactly.
wishes
The
for,
leanest
right?
cuts, no hormones, no antibiotics,
Everything.
no any of
Yep.
these kinds of things. And so the point then becomes when you see these statistics, which by the way are brand new statistics, nobody ever had these statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Not in our entire history of North American conservation did anyone ever have these. You start to say, well, okay, how big is that? Well, relative to the total consumption of meat, let's say, in Canada and the United States, it's a modest proportion.
Mm-hmm.
But then you start to break that down, as you must, to think about, just like economies, how they really work. A considerable portion of all of those meals is consumed in more rural areas
Right.
of the country, by and large. That's also something we can, of course, back up because we can show that.
Right.
And therefore, the amount of food impact that those harvests are having is disproportionately much greater there, all the way to a point where, for many families, the primary amount of wild food or meat that they're consuming in a year actually comes from these wild harvests. Yeah. So you see this scale. First of all, there is this big number that says all of this is happening. It's a very big number, but it's relatively small next to perhaps the total meat consumption of the country. Mm-hmm. But when you look at it from a regional and local perspective, the percentage that it represents of the total meat that those houses and their incomes consume and pay out for, this wild meat is extremely, extremely significant. And it is also true, of course, that a lot of the other economic benefits that come from hunting, such as expenditures on transportation, hotel rooms,
right.
and
all that,
groceries and so on, a lot of that too, when you look at it, is a big number, but it's a relatively small number next to all other enterprises in the United States, perhaps. But again, that money is primarily being spent in the more rural, less urban centers, obviously, of the country, and contributing, therefore, to the local economies of places where it is harder to build local economies. Let's face it.
It is.
Again, all of this says to me, number one, we've never fully estimated and understood the impact of this from a food procurement and food security point of view. Secondly, we've never been able to build a fully economic interpretation of what the value of hunting and angling and these berry picking, any of these activities have been, because we never had the food value. So if you never had the food value to add into that equation, you could never give the complete value of what's going on here. And we are now going to have that, and we are going to start to weave that into these broader economic and socioeconomic evaluations. And that's why I believe that this will be like a Pandora's box. We'll provide a package of statistics and information and reports and documents and films and maybe a book on this and so on and so forth. But other people will unpack that box and look at it in their own way, in their own district, and compare it to whatever they're most interested in, And we'll be able to look at things from a food perspective and not just say, why does state X only able to harvest 55 elk and state Y is able to harvest, 200 elk? Let's just use those simple numbers. We'll be able to ask a question like, how is it that state A is only able to provide, 100,000 meals of elk to its citizens, and the state over there next to it is able to provide 500,000 meals to its citizens? Yeah. This is, again, the kind of different thinking that can come into this that I would like to see happen.
Yeah. Well, and when you just touching on some of the numbers that you have, I think about 1.5 billion meals. Our combined population of the two countries is 370 million.
Yep.
So we're talking more than 4 meals for every adult and child.
Yes.
In both countries.
Yes.
And when you do, as you say, think about, there's some parts where that's happening in greater levels, some where it's probably happening
very little.
Very little. For those where it is happening, the reliance on that, the value to that, the food security value of that, there are just so many things. It puts it out there to force us to ask the question, how would we even consider policies that don't acknowledge that?
Yes.
And represent what that food value is to those places where it is a higher portion?
Yes.
Are they not deserving of the consideration?
Sure. And
It's
that's a very good point. And then you think about that all of this is being procured by 3.5% of the people in our society. Now, when we add the berries and the medicinal plants and the shed antlers and the wild honey and the wild syrups and the wild leeks and wild rices and all these kinds of things, fisheries, it's going to grow and it's going to grow and it's going to grow. And in fact, there's no reason conceptually why eventually we wouldn't actually add in the commercial fisheries at sea for our nations. Why? It's still harvesting from the wild.
right.
It's still an example of what's now all of a sudden we are in the mainstream of food procurement.
Yeah.
There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we have lots of food supplies that are not excessively large. I mean, you can go to restaurant or to supermarkets and buy quail, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a big product, but they're still part of that food chain. Or geese, they're still part of that food chain. So I think we will be forced to recalibrate a lot of our thinking when we start to look at these statistics and really start to mobilize them when we get the next 3 years of data together.
Yeah.
The first, we have to look at this program. The first phase was to build a partnership, because it needed resources and it needed commitment, obviously, to build something of this scale.
Mm-hmm.
We had to discover how we could get this information, how much difficulty would there be of getting it and verifying it.
Right.
We had to then figure out, when we got the information, whether it was accurate, and when we did have it accurately assembled. And of course we had to build a pretty intricate database to house all of this. Then we had to figure out all these questions of body weights, as we talked about before, consumable weights, trying to give the numbers to these particular cuts of meat and so on from certain species. So we used that first phase of the effort to work out all of those bugs and to experiment with our social media and to see what people were interested in seeing and to write the articles for Field and Stream and write the articles for Sports Afield and write the articles for various places, the Wildlife Societies, Professional, and so on. And now and to run our first surveys of meat sharing in the States. But now we feel we have run over and planed down all the bumps and splinters on these boards. And we feel now we are able to run with this next large chunk of data and start to produce. We've already come up with 6 fact sheets on 6 different species that gives you all of the information on how much food is produced, where it's produced, heat maps that show you in which states most of that food comes from, and so on. They too are experiments. Now when we have the big data set, we will release it on every species that we have in this country that is hunted, that is harvested. We will have these species profiles, and you'll be able to look at it across the board and show who's producing a lot of this and who's producing very little. You'll be able to combine it within regions, like the western region of the United States versus the eastern region versus parts of Canada. And so it will become what we hope will be a very interactive thing. And anybody who is then interested in knowing about all of these harvests will be able to go online and, with certain levels of access, click on this and play with that data. And Randy might want to have somebody on his podcast that he wants to talk about, well, how much wild food are we getting from elk in this state? Well, I know exactly where to get that. I go to the Wild Harvest Initiative and I look at that data. There it is, and it's calculated for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
And I want to go back ultimately and bring in all the data before 2014, which was the year we started gathering data, and go back as far as we possibly can historically, because I want to also build the cumulative amount of food that has come as a result of our conservation policies in this country. And that, sure as hell, is not going to be a small amount of food.
That is going to be very significant.
And you have to remember, Randy, that we are only talking about the legal guys.
Right.
Now let's face it. There's a few lads and ladies out there that are not always carrying a permit in their pocket, but who are also harvesting and are also eating.
Yeah.
So Now, I'm going to be talking to enforcement individuals to try to get some idea of what relative percentage that might be. Could be another third of that amount of food.
Whoa.
Could be another 20% of that amount of food. You know, I don't know at this point. They're the experts in this, but I bet you they have not rough, I'd say they have fairly good estimates of how many people they think, you know, acquire meat illegally as well. And there are people everywhere doing it.
Right.